Before the dust came, the Great Plains were a land of promise. Stretching across parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, the region had long been known for its vast open spaces and fertile soil. For generations, people had worked the land, raising crops and building communities across what many called America's breadbasket. In the years following the First World War, that promise seemed greater than ever. Wheat prices were high, demand was strong. New farming equipment allowed farmers to cultivate larger areas than previous generations could have imagined. Across the plains, fields that had once been covered in native grasses were plowed and planted. For many families, it felt like the beginning of a better future. New towns appeared, businesses expanded, farmhouses were built across the landscape. Newspapers spoke confidently about prosperity and growth. The Great Plains had always been a difficult place to live. Summers were hot, winters could be harsh. Rainfall was unpredictable. But during the 1920s, several years of favorable weather created confidence. Many people came to believe the land itself had changed. Old warnings about drought were often ignored. Stories passed down from earlier generations about dry years and crop failures seemed increasingly distant. After all, the fields were producing, crops were growing, money was being made. As more land was cleared and plowed, fewer native grasses remained. For thousands of years, those grasses had played an important role in protecting the soil. Their deep roots held the ground together and helped retain moisture during dry periods. Most farmers had no reason to think much about this. The grass was simply something that stood in the way of planting more crops. Across the region, millions of acres were converted into farmland. At the time, it seemed like progress. Families invested their savings into land and equipment. Many borrowed money in hopes of expanding their operations. Others arrived from different parts of the country looking for opportunity. The Great Plains appeared to offer plenty of it. Yet beneath the surface, conditions were quietly changing. The weather patterns that had helped fuel the agricultural boom began to shift. Rain became less frequent. The soil became drier. And slowly, almost unnoticed at first, the stage was being set for one of the worst environmental disasters in American history. No one knew it yet, but the years of prosperity were coming to an end. The land that had seemed so generous during the 1920s would soon become the source of unimaginable hardship. For the people living across the Great Plains, life was about to change in ways few could have imagined. The storms that would eventually come were unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. And when they arrived, they would transform the landscape, force hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, and leave a mark on the country that can still be felt today. But before the great dust storms swept across the plains, another disaster arrived first. The rain stopped falling. The early signs were easy to miss. One dry season was not unusual on the Great Plains. Farmers had always dealt with changing weather. Most assumed better conditions would return. But the rain did not return. Year after year, conditions worsened. Streams shrank. Ponds dried up. Crops struggled to survive. Across the region, farmers watched their fields with growing concern. Seeds that once produced healthy harvests now struggled to sprout. Young crops withered beneath the hot sun. Livestock suffered as grazing land disappeared. The timing could hardly have been worse. In 1929, the United States entered the Great Depression. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. For farming families already facing drought, the economic collapse created even greater hardship. Crop prices fell sharply. Even when farmers managed to produce a harvest, they often received far less money for it than they had only a few years earlier. Many families found themselves trapped. They owed money on land. They owed money on equipment. They owed money to banks. Yet their crops continued to fail. As the drought spread across the plains, the soil became increasingly vulnerable. For generations, native grasses had anchored the earth with deep root systems. Now, much of that protection was gone. The land lay exposed, and the wind was coming. At first, people noticed small clouds of dust blowing across empty fields. Then the dust clouds grew larger. Each passing storm carried away more topsoil. What had once been rich farmland began to disappear into the air. Few people understood the scale of what was about to happen. The Great Plains were being transformed. The disaster was no longer just a drought. It was becoming something much worse. Something that would soon earn a name known throughout the world. The Dust Bowl. The storms often appeared without warning. People would look toward the horizon and see what seemed to be a dark wall stretching across the landscape. At first glance, it resembled a thunderstorm, but it was not rain. It was dust. Millions of tons of dry soil lifted into the air by powerful winds. Some storms rose thousands of feet into the sky. Others stretched for hundreds of miles. As they approached, daylight began to disappear. The sun vanished behind clouds of dirt. Entire towns were plunged into darkness in the middle of the afternoon. People described conditions that felt almost unreal. Streetlights came on during the day. Drivers pulled off roads because they could no longer see. Families rushed indoors and sealed windows with blankets and damp cloths. Still, the dust found its way inside. It slipped through cracks around doors. It settled onto furniture. It covered dishes, clothing, and beds. Many families woke each morning to find fine layers of dust spread across everything they owned. Breathing became difficult. Doctors began seeing patients suffering from what became known as dust pneumonia. Children and older adults were especially vulnerable. Livestock also suffered. Cattle became sick. Some animals suffocated during severe storms. Others starved as grazing land disappeared beneath drifting soil. One of the most famous storms occurred on April 14, 1935. The day became known as Black Sunday. A massive wall of dust swept across the plains, carrying an estimated hundreds of millions of tons of topsoil. Witnesses described the storm as a moving mountain of darkness. For many Americans, Black Sunday became the moment they realized the disaster had reached unimaginable proportions. The Dust Bowl was no longer a regional problem. It had become a national crisis. For many families, there eventually came a point when staying was no longer possible. The crops were gone. The livestock were gone. The savings were gone. All that remained was the difficult decision of whether to leave. Hundreds of thousands of people packed their belongings into cars, trucks, and wagons. Some sold everything they could. Others simply abandoned what they could not carry. Their destination was often California. Stories spread of jobs, fertile farmland, and better opportunities on the West Coast. To reach those opportunities, many traveled along Route 66. The highway became a path of hope for families seeking a fresh start. The journey was not easy. Money was scarce. Vehicles frequently broke down. Many families spent weeks traveling across the Southwest. Yet they continued westward. Some eventually found work. Others struggled for years. But regardless of the outcome, the migration permanently changed the American West. Over time, the drought eased. Rain returned to portions of the Great Plains. The federal government introduced conservation programs and new farming practices designed to protect the soil. Farmers planted windbreaks. New techniques reduced erosion. Slowly, the land began to recover. The Dust Bowl eventually ended. Its lessons, however, remained. It revealed how closely people depend on the land around them. It showed the consequences of ignoring nature's limits. And it demonstrated the resilience of families who endured one of the most difficult environmental disasters in American history. Today, the Dust Bowl remains a powerful reminder of a time when the wind carried away entire fields, darkened the midday sky, and changed the course of countless lives. The storms passed. The dust settled. But the story remains, and nearly a century later, it is still worth remembering.